California, long renowned as one of the most beautiful, bountiful places in the world, has, in fact, been home to many of the most brutal battles in American history. Now, History at the OK Corral brings you the stories of the most brutal battles in the history of California. San Diego, California, December 5th, 1846. As a dreary overcast sky looms above them, Captain Archibald Gillespie and his detachment of 40 U.S. Marines ride east from the city into the dry, chaparral-covered desert that looms endlessly before them. They are on their way to join forces with Brigadier General Stephen F. Kearny and his force of 200 troops, who have sent word to the Marines that they are caught in dire straits in the middle of the Southern California desert. General Kearny and his men have traveled to their current location, roughly 30 miles east of the bustling pueblo of San Diego, as part of the United States' efforts during the ongoing Mexican-American War. Though they have endured seemingly endless hardships on their journey from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, to the city of Santa Fe, and then across the vast expanses of the deserts of present-day New Mexico and Arizona, before finally reaching the deserts of Alta California, most of the men are eager to find and engage their enemy in the Mexican army. However, General Kearny's force is still diminutive in size and thousands of miles away from their closest support to the east. Seeing the increasingly dangerous circumstances, Kearny had seen it necessary to send a rider to San Diego requesting reinforcements. This request reached the headquarters of Captain Archibald Gillespie, where he had hurriedly marshaled the contingent of U.S. Marines he now leads eastward in their effort to reach General Kearny and his men before they are forced to engage with the local forces that are surely reconnoitering the hills around them. These local forces, Gillespie and his men are well aware, are unlike the rest of their counterparts in the Mexican army, whom the U.S. forces have combated in the previous few years. With Alta or Upper California comprising the northernmost reaches of Mexican territory, its inhabitants, Mexican citizens known as Californios, have adapted their country's culture to fit their environs. In the vast expanses of Californio ranchos, which could comprise thousands of acres, becoming an adept horseman was essential not only for working vaqueros, but also everyday citizens simply wishing to get from one place to another in this expansive land. Throughout the whole of Mexico, the Californios were regarded as unmatched in not only their horsemanship, but their adroitness in wielding their long leather riatas, precursors to the modern-day cowboy's rope. It was said that a Californio would rather climb atop his horse and ride 100 yards rather than walk it, and that any Californio was a better roper with his foot than the average Mexican was with his hand. But these are not the only attributes that separate the Californio soldiers that General Kearny and his men will be facing and the regular Mexican army fighting further to the south. Their most noticeable characteristic, and perhaps their most dangerous, is evident even from afar to the scouts and soldiers watching them from the cover of the dense chaparral brush. Long, steel-tipped lances jut upward several feet from over the heads of each Californio rider, giving them an air of medieval simplicity that seems antiquated even here in the 1840s Southern California desert. But, while many among the Americans find the spectacle to be nearly comical, the damage that these lances can inflict is far from a laughing matter for anyone faced with combating them. Though the Californios are lacking in way of firearms and ammunition, their ability to inflict grievous wounds upon their adversaries before dashing away gives them a capability scarcely seen outside of the mighty tribes of the American plains, like the Cheyenne, the Lakota, and the Comanche. Against a fighting force armed with single-shot carbines, they present a formidable foe. It had been at what history has come to know as the Battle of the Old Woman's Gun, when a detachment of unfortunate U.S. Navy sailors, Marines, and civilian volunteers had attempted to march on the burgeoning city of Los Angeles in an effort to quell an uprising in the area that had been previously conquered by American forces. This detachment, composed of 310 men, had been caught by the Californios just outside of the city and made to pay dearly over the course of a battle that lasted a night and the succeeding day. During the engagement, 4 American sailors had been killed, and 6 additional men gravely wounded at the end of the Californios' lances. Captain Archibald Gillespie, for his part, has spent the previous few months clinging tenuously to any semblance of power over the city of Los Angeles, having been appointed to the post by Robert F. Stockton, with explicit orders to rule over the city with a strict eye and an unforgiving hand. But after continued unrest from the inhabitants of the city, with some in support of the Americans' efforts and some vehemently opposed, Stockton and Gillespie retreated southward by sailing to San Diego on October 26, 1846. They arrived 5 days later, on October 31st, and were welcomed by the local inhabitants of the besieged city to take part in their celebrations of All Souls' Day. However, despite their warm reception, the men had found San Diego to be all but bereft of usable horses, mules, and cattle. While Stockton had returned north to Monterey, where Commanding Officer John C. Fremont was experiencing similar problems, Captain Gillespie and his men had set about procuring as many animals and supplies as they could while staying within the good graces of the citizens. At this critical juncture in the Mexican-American War, the Americans now found themselves clinging to largely nominal control of the Southern California coastline stretching down from San Francisco. They were running low on men, ammunition, and supplies. However, General John Kearny, on his trek westward from the desert, mistakenly believed his countrymen to have solidified a strong measure of control over nearly the whole of the territory. In the middle of the New Mexico desert, Kearny and his men had happened upon none other than the legendary mountain man Kit Carson, whom John C. Fremont had dispatched to Washington to carry correspondence regarding the Americans' progress in Alta California. After reviewing these dispatches, General Kearny had felt so hopeful as to the state of the Americans' advancement that he sent nearly half of his forces back to Santa Fe. He did, however, enlist the famed Carson to accompany him and his men back to Southern California. Now, Carson, among the most experienced in the group by far in matters of frontier warfare, rides with Kearny's cavalry, dressed in his mountain man trappings and sitting astride his sure-footed mule. He shares Kearny's growing concern with the group's isolation. The men amongst the cavalry, however, are by and large in high spirits, despite the toll taken on themselves and their animals by the months-long journey west. They have come here to fight what they believe to be a markedly inferior enemy, not only lacking in their training and equipment, but in fact relegated to using centuries-old technology in a desperate bid against a superior foe. Still, the obviousness of their predicament is not lost on the men of the cavalry, and all among them welcome the sight of Captain Gillespie and his Marines rumbling towards them in the afternoon, kicking up a sizable cloud of dust and towing with them a small brass cannon to add to the artillery firepower of the soldiers. Kearny and Carson both warmly greet Gillespie, who informs the general, much to his chagrin, that the state of affairs for the Americans in Southern California has deteriorated, even in the time since Carson has skulked out of San Diego with his secret correspondence for President James K. Polk. He also assures them that their suspicions that the Californios might be very close by are likely justified. Unfortunately for the Americans, Gillespie is more correct than he knows, as word of he and his men's departing San Diego has already reached two nearby parties of Californio Lancers. One, commanded by Leonardo Cota and Jose Alipas, is stationed at San Luis Rey to the north. When word reaches their headquarters, a contingent of Lancers immediately heads south to join forces with their brethren in order to mount an attack. Meanwhile, the second contingent of Lancer forces, commanded by Don Andres Pico, brother of the governor Pio Pico, is stationed in San Diego. Don Andres commands virtually the whole of the city outside of the American-held ports. He has now received word that the group of Marines has evaded Mexican security forces and is headed east into the desert. As yet unaware of Kearny's forces, they assume the men are yet again attempting to scour the countryside in search of horses and cattle. The two forces meet at San Luis Rey, where Pico, the senior officer, sees fit to divide their forces in an effort to more effectively scout the vast expanse of desert. Half of the men are sent south to El Cajon, while Pico and his contingent of 78 men make their way east into the desert, scouring the landscape for any sign of intruding American forces. In the late afternoon, the Californios arrive at the small Native American village of San Pascual. The residents, largely terrified of the Californios after decades of incursion and mistreatment on their part, flee their homes, leaving their shelters to Pico and his men. But that evening, as Pico and his men cook their evening meals over the coals of the natives' fires, one of the tribespeople suddenly comes running back into the village, reporting that they have been found and detained by nearby American forces, numbering far larger than Pico had expected Captain Gillespie's force of Marines to be. Believing the natives' claims to be either lies or outright delusions, Pico largely dismisses them. However, only a few miles away, the flickering candles inside General Kearny's field headquarters tent illuminate the shadows of Kearny, Gillespie, Kit Carson, and a number of other officers as they now discuss what steps to take next, knowing that their enemy is almost certainly close at hand. It is decided that scouts will be sent out to reconnoiter the area and determine the size and strength of the Californio's forces. Lieutenant Thomas C. Hammond is appointed to command a small group of scouts, including some local natives, among them a man named Rafael Machado, who is familiar with both the tactics of the Californios as well as the terrain. In the pre-dawn hours, they ride into the countryside, disappearing into the darkness. Soon, Machado has discerned the location of the Californios at San Pascual. He even crawls forward through the brush, garnering a close enough vantage point to confirm that these mostly sleeping men are in fact Pio's forces. But after Machado is gone for a longer time than he had planned, Lieutenant Hammond becomes anxious that the native Californio Machado has double-crossed him and alerted Pico's men to his presence. Concerned that they will be the victims of an ambush, Hammond orders the remainder of his men to follow him in a silent charge into the village. Despite the men remaining silent, the clattering of their weapons and the pounding of their horses' hooves alert the Californio sentries on watch. Machado is discovered by his companions in this charge, having in fact steadfastly done his duty, and now remounts and joins his cohorts in a hurried retreat as the Californio guards order them to halt. In their haste, one of the soldiers drops their dark blue coat, with the tag U.S. Army sewn on it. Now, not only is Pico aware of the presence of the Americans, he has evidence that there is a larger force afoot than the 39 Marines who had left San Diego. As Lieutenant Hammond breathlessly reports the news of their discovery to General Kearny, Kearny mulls over his options. He decides, against the advice of Carson, that since the element of surprise has now been lost, they must make their attack as quickly as possible. As an early morning frost coats the blankets of the sleeping men, and a thick fog covers the landscape, they are suddenly shaken awake by their officers, and told to make ready for a charge. After shaking off their restless night's sleep, many of the young men are eager to mount up and make the charge to glory that they have traveled so far to take part in. Kearny has, however, taken a number of steps in order to mitigate their risk. He has ordered that their main objective will be to surround the village of San Pascual, capture their horses, and take the men prisoner. However, the general, Carson, and Gillespie are all dubious as to whether or not this plan will be entirely realistic. Meanwhile, the forward observers from Pico's force of Californios dot the horizon with their silhouettes, keenly gathering some rather surprising intelligence as they take stock of the number of Americans present, not so large that an attack would be out of the question, and the condition of their stock, who are now so gaunt after their cross-continental trek that many of them seem near death. Within 15 minutes of being awakened, the men are organizing into their well-drilled formations in preparation for battle. When they had first left Kansas, their companies had been arranged according to the color of their horses, their animals well-fed and energetic, the men's uniforms pressed and well-kempt, and their weapons cleaned, oiled, and ready for use. Now, many of the men ride mules or horses mismatched from their units, and the animals' current state significantly affects their ability to perform. To make matters worse, their carbines cannot be counted on to fire in the damp morning conditions. Thus, this attack will be relegated to swords and single-shot pistols, with the carbine's only use now being in wielding it as a club. The men separate into 3 guards, with the advance guard being commanded by Captain Abram R. Johnston. General Kearny commands the guard behind them, but as the men move out towards the small valley that ensconces the village of San Pascual, they begin to separate from each other at a greater and greater rate during the course of their travel. As the men near the village, a critical mishap takes place. With the distance between them making the commands all but inaudible, General Kearny's command for Captain Johnston to proceed in a, quote, trot is misheard as a gallop. This is a grave mistake, as the distance to the village is too far for the exhausted horses to reach at full speed, and the advanced force would be too far ahead of the second column for the second column to provide adequate relief. Still, Johnston dutifully issues the order, and the men in the advanced column urge their horses into a gallop. Seeing this, General Kearny is horrified. He exclaims, "Good heavens, I did not mean that!" However, it is too late, and now the distance between the two forces grows even faster. Snapping into action, Kit Carson urges his mule into a full gallop of its own, attempting to catch up to the runaway column, as Kearny keeps his troops at a trot so as not to lose complete control of the battle before it begins. Carson and his mule catch up to the charging Captain Johnston, whose column is now reaching the expanse of the open valley floor. A half a mile away, they can see the village. The attack is now imminent. The 12-man column charges on, with its men roaring out in whoops and battle cries as they make their charge upon the village. But Pico and his Californios have taken cover in a small ravine next to the village, and from here let loose an initial volley of musket fire from their limited collection of firearms. As the gun smoke mixes with the thick fog, Captain Johnston falls from his mount, killed by a musket ball to the head. Riding directly behind him, Kit Carson sees the captain fall. This trips up his own mount, and his normally sure-footed mule takes a disastrous tumble to the ground, launching Carson several yards ahead of the animal, where he lands splayed out and in a daze, before hurriedly scrambling out of the way of the rest of the charging column. The charging soldiers attempt to loose a volley of their own, but most find that their weapons have indeed been rendered useless in the damp conditions. Now, the 11 remaining Americans draw their long sabers and charge head-on towards the Californios. At first, the Californios feign a retreat, momentarily seeming to scatter their forces to the west as they flee along the path of a small creek near the village. Captain Ben Moore, now the officer in charge with Johnston having been killed in the action, orders the men to pursue the Californios immediately. This the men do, giving chase down the banks of the small waterway. But this pursuit draws out their forces even further, making them easy targets for their enemy. As Kearny, Gillespie, and the rest of the men make their way across the valley as quickly as they can on their bedraggled mounts, they can only watch the horror that unfolds next. The Californios, seeing the compromised state of the Americans' forces, now wheel their fine, well-fed, and well-trained horses around, and make a head-on charge towards the soldiers still pursuing them. Within moments, they have surrounded the Americans in a whirling cyclone from which they can strike with their long lances, inflicting deep, grievous wounds, while others among them throw their leather riatas with expert efficiency, ensnaring and unsaddling riders who can then be pounced upon and dispatched in brutal fashion by other lance-wielding Californios. Captain Moore charges at Captain Pico himself, firing off an errant shot from his single-shot pistol before drawing his saber. He engages Pico, an expert swordsman, who manages to slash Moore with his own saber. As Moore attempts to fight off Pico's sword slashes and thrusts, 2 of Pico's men make separate charges upon the American officer, driving their lances deep into his torso and eventually sending him crumbling to the ground. The fall breaks the blade of Moore's saber, leaving him only the handle of the weapon with which to defend himself. He crawls to a spot near the river, attempting to club and bash any Californio who comes near, but he is soon finished off by a Californio with a pistol. Now, more Americans are starting to arrive at the battlefield, including General Kearny and Captain Gillespie. As he fights, Kearny is viciously wounded by a lance that pierces his lower back. Gillespie fights off numerous vociferous attacks directed at him by a number of attacking lancers, many of whom know who he is and are intent on exacting vengeance upon him personally. For his part, Kit Carson has managed to obtain one of the carbines from the dead U.S. soldiers, one that he miraculously finds to be in working order. He now sits ensconced behind a small rock formation, proffering effective, lethal fire against any Californio who comes within range of his position. Finally, the brass cannons being towed towards the rear of the third column are brought to the field by the American forces, and a powerful volley is let loose towards the Californios. Though it has little effect in the way of lethality, it does manage to momentarily scatter Pico's forces. Now, as Pico and his men survey the battlefield from out of range of the cannons, they are overwhelmed with a collective joy at not only having survived, but tactically dominated a better trained, better equipped, and much larger opposition force. For their part, General Kearney, Captain Gillespie, and Kit Carson are now left to survey a macabre scene of death and gore that seems to cover the whole of the valley floor. They are now trapped here, with many dead and many wounded, still 30 miles from the nearest friendly forces in San Diego, and with Pico and his Californios now stalking the hills all around them in order to cut off any route of escape. During the night, the men who are uninjured go about the grisly task of digging a large communal grave for their comrades, before laying their bodies down inside of it, covering them up, and walking their horses over the top to tamp down the ground to keep their comrades' bodies safe from the frothing packs of hungry wolves that now seem to fill the valley, having smelled the blood and viscera that now litter its floor. In the next few days, the Californios will take great hope in their ability to perhaps defend themselves from the encroaching American forces after so many months of doubt. They will hound General Kearney's forces, making any likelihood of their escape to San Diego, especially with many wounded in tow, nearly impossible. It will ultimately be up to Kit Carson, as well as a native guide and a naval officer, who will volunteer to make a death-defying nighttime trek to San Diego in hopes of garnering relief forces for their comrades. But the story of Kit Carson and his comrades' impossible task, and the conclusion of the brutal, bloody, and callous Mexican-American War are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Los Angeles, California, January 8, 1848. As bullets slam into the water all around them, a force of just over 500 American soldiers, sailors, and Marines are caught in the middle of the San Gabriel River. Their mission is to attack a fort manned by Mexican soldiers which lies just to the north of this river. But, much to their growing terror, the river has proven more difficult to cross than they had anticipated, with their heavy cannons and armaments making the task even more arduous. As they pour fire into the attacking Americans from their positions behind the fort walls, the desperation amongst the Mexican troops is also palpable. They know that they are not only dwarfed in number by the oncoming American forces, but they are also running low on ammunition, a problem which now plagues the Mexican army in these late stages of the Mexican-American War. Now, their only hope is to make the most of what meager ammunition they do have, or they will be overrun, and their homeland of Alta California will likely be lost. Every man on either side of this battle knows the stakes at hand, and thus a vicious fight now unfolds. As bullets whiz by them and the cries of wounded men and animals fill the air, many of the Americans crossing the rather innocuous-looking river suddenly find themselves quite literally bogged down in a pocket of quicksand. This makes them easy targets for their Mexican adversaries, and gunfire from the fortress quickly begins to concentrate on the unfortunate Americans now momentarily stuck midway across the river. Unfortunately for the Mexican troops, the poor quality of their gunpowder and dwindling ammunition supplies makes precision firing all but impossible. However, despite the relatively inaccurate fire, they attempt to make up for this deficiency with volume and intensity of fire in a last-ditch effort to thwart the attack. In a matter of only a few seconds, the American advance seemingly devolves into unadulterated chaos. However, for these American forces fighting roughly 3,000 miles away from their nation's capital, chaos has unfortunately been the order of the day in the preceding week leading up to this battle. As the fog of war engulfs them, many are unsure exactly who is in charge. Commodore Robert F. Stockton has argued vociferously for weeks with General Stephen Watts Kearny over which of the two men is truly in command of American forces here in Mexican-held Alta California. General Kearny has, in fact, already accomplished the longest, most arduous cross-country trek in U.S. Army history by leading his, quote, Army of the West from Washington, D.C. to San Diego, California. Here, he had joined forces with Stockton's men at the Battle of San Pascual, where they narrowly escaped total annihilation at the hands of the Mexican army. Now, the arduous trek, in combination with the hard-fought battle, has greatly depleted not only Kearny's men, but the horses that his cavalry soldiers rely so heavily upon. Now, on the outskirts of Los Angeles, he finds his forces to be far fewer in number than those commanded by Commodore Stockton. Commodore Robert F. Stockton, the 52-year-old New Jersey-born veteran naval officer, has held firm in his assertion that, since he has more men under his command, he should rightfully be in charge of the entire attacking force. Though General Kearny in fact has the military authority to override Stockton's demands, he eventually acquiesces to giving Stockton at least nominal command. Now, as the American forces struggle to dislodge their artillery pieces from the river bottom's thick mud, Stockton does indeed take the opportunity to assert his leadership, coolly directing and assisting the men in digging out the cannons and then hauling them to the opposite shore, step by arduous step, all while under continuous fire. Finally, after reaching the opposite bank, Stockton directs the men to take cover behind one of the high river banks and then to form a square around their baggage and cattle. From here, it is agreed between Stockton and Kearny that Kearny will lead an assaulting force to move forward on the Mexican position, while Stockton will direct the placement and firing of the cannons with the goal of knocking out the Mexicans' artillery. Meanwhile, seeing their efforts to stop the Americans' crossing has failed, General Jose Maria Flores orders his cavalry troops, the famed Californio Lancers, to take the field in a headlong offensive against the Americans' position. The Lancers, known for their seemingly anachronistic choice in weaponry with their 14-foot-long steel-tipped lances, have, in fact, proven lethally effective thus far, even against forces armed with vastly superior firepower. This is due largely to the Californios' prowess as horsemen. Capable of feats that would later be relegated only to trick riders, the Californios, men and women alike, are often remarked upon by contemporary observers as the finest riders in the world, bar none. It is said that a Californio is more likely to saddle their horse and ride 100 yards than they are to walk it. This combination of unequaled mobility and tactical proficiency makes them a formidable opponent, indeed, even to an American army armed with the latest in firearm technology. Kearny and his men, constituting the left side of the square formation, meet this attacking force of lancers. The Mexican cavalrymen bear down upon them at full speed, crying, "Viva California!" Kearny orders his forces to detach from the square formation and, after a harrowing series of courageous but ultimately ineffective charges from the Californios, they are able to drive the Lancers into retreat. Back with the remainder of the American forces and their cannons, Stockton orders the artillery pieces quickly maneuvered out of cover and into position to fire. This is done quickly and enthusiastically by the American artillerymen as they sense victory to be near. Many among the American men are aware that it was 32 years ago, to the day, that General Andrew Jackson had engaged the British at the Battle of New Orleans. Now, an American battle cry wells up from the assembled soldiers, sailors, and Marines as Stockton orders a full-on charge upon the Mexican position. Shouts of "New Orleans! New Orleans!" now fill the air as the Americans rush across the open field towards the Mexican defenders. With their gunpowder and ammunition all but gone, Flores now orders a retreat to the nearby Puebla of Los Angeles. The Mexican soldiers, lancers, and volunteers now relinquish their positions and hastily make their way to Los Angeles as the Americans swarm the newly vacated position. The entire fight has lasted approximately 90 minutes. Despite the relatively short duration and relatively low death and casualty count on both sides, the consequences of this battle will have reverberations that shape the fate of both nations in the centuries to come. In spite of Kearny and Stockton's dispute over full command of the American forces at the San Gabriel River, it will be General Kearny who issues the official report on the battle to officials back in Washington, D.C. The report, which seems to cast Commodore Stockton as less co-commander and more helpful assistant, is written 3 days after the battle. It reads as follows. Headquarters, Army of the West, Ciudad de Los Angeles, Upper California, January 12, 1847. Sir, I have the honor to report that at the request of Commodore R.F. Stockton, who in September last assumed the title of Governor of California, I consented to take command of an expedition to this place, capital of the country, and that, on the 29th of December, I left San Diego with about 500 men, consisting of 60 dismounted dragoons under Captain Turner, 50 California volunteers, and the remainder of Marines and sailors with a battery of artillery. Lieutenant Emery, topographical engineers, acted as Assistant Adjutant General. Commodore Stockton accompanied us. We proceeded on our route without seeing the enemy until the 8th instant, when they showed themselves in full force of 600 mounted men with 4 pieces of artillery under their Governor Flores, occupying the heights in front of us which commanded the crossing of the river San Gabriel, and they ready to oppose our further progress. The necessary disposition of our troops was immediately made by covering our front with a strong party of skirmishers, placing our wagons and baggage train in the rear of them, and protecting the flanks and rear with the remainder of the command. We then proceeded, forded the river, carried the heights, and drove the enemy from them after an action of about 1.5 hours, during which they made a charge upon our left flank, which was repulsed. Soon after which they retreated and left us in possession of the field on which we encamped that night. Our loss in the actions was small, being 1 private killed and 2 officers, Lieutenant Renshaw of the Navy and Captain Gillespie of the Volunteers, and 11 privates wounded. The enemy, mounted on fine horses and being the best riders in the world, carried off their killed and wounded, and we know not the number of them, though it must have been considerable. After seizing control of the Mexican position, Kearny, Stockton, and the American forces now make camp atop the mesa overlooking Los Angeles. All among them know that the victory they have won on this day is indeed a decisive one, and that seizing control of the whole of the California territory is now as close as overtaking the small Puebla only a few miles away. Meanwhile, the soldiers and citizens now effectively trapped within the confines of Los Angeles pensively take stock of their circumstances. They are virtually devoid of usable ammunition and quality gunpowder, and have been forced to forfeit virtually all of their territories in the span of only a few months. Many among them have in fact long argued for annexation by the United States, having grown weary of dismissive treatment of themselves and their lands by the Mexican government, who by and large considers their northern territories to be both of little value and little import. The year prior, their own governor, Pio Pico, had already fled south, ostensibly to argue for more support in front of the Mexican Congress. But his faith in his own government's willingness and ability to support him had waned so significantly that he had, in fact, argued for the annexation of California as a British protectorate just prior to the outbreak of the Mexican-American War. Amongst the citizens of Los Angeles, the city Pico himself had designated as California's capital, his conspicuous absence is increasingly attributed to his fear of being captured by the advancing Americans. Now, save for a few governing officials and military officers, the Californios have essentially been left to fend for themselves against the oncoming Americans. Many of them are simply tired of their young men fighting and dying for a government who seems unable and unwilling to outfit them with proper weapons and officers. However, there are many who insist that the American incursion must be halted at all costs. Ceding control of their territory, they argue, will ultimately mean ceding their very culture and way of life. Despite the growing consternation amongst the Californio people, the overarching sentiment amongst the vast majority of them is that they must fight on to the bitter end against the Americans. And so, the fight will carry on. Los Angeles, it is agreed, must be fought for. In the succeeding days, the Battle of La Mesa will take place, and the lives of the Californios, as well as the futures of Mexico and America, will be changed forever. But the accounts of that battle, as well as the many tales of the countless other battles fought in the brutal and bloody Mexican-American War, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Monterey, California, March 6, 1846. As a cool wind whips over their position atop a high mountain peak, John C. Fremont looks down upon the amassing forces of Mexican Army troops with equal parts disdain and trepidation. Above him, attached to a long fallen tree branch turned into a makeshift flagpole, the American flag flutters in the breeze. Every man atop this Northern California mountain peak knows that their presence here is already tantamount to trespassing, and that Fremont's insistence on climbing to their current position and then raising the American flag is an explicit and obvious declaration of war against the ruling Mexican government. Fremont, already a national celebrity for his accomplishments as an explorer and military man, has climbed to his current location with his force of 60 American soldiers, sailors, and frontiersmen in hopes of making a stand against the vastly superior forces of the Mexican Army deep in the heart of Californio territory. As word spreads to Mexican officials in the surrounding territories, the open fields in the valleys below the mountain begin to fill with more and more Mexican troops and local volunteers. Meanwhile, atop the peak, Fremont has ordered the construction of a makeshift timber fort in order to create some measure of bulwark defense against the overwhelming attack to come. As his men hack down trees and dig post holes into the dense, dark mountain soil, Fremont is confronted with the increasingly stark reality of his and his men's situation. The mood amongst the Americans is tense, and speech amongst the men is terse and unsure. Many see their present circumstances as all too reminiscent of the infamous 1836 Battle of the Alamo, in which 180 brave Texans had perished in a valiant but incredibly brutal last stand, which had cost every one of them their lives. Now, many among the Americans atop the high Northern California peak fear that they, too, will meet a similar fate. They are, in point of fact, trespassers in a foreign land, here under the false and transparently flimsy pretext that they are merely wayward American explorers, who simply happened upon this territory while on a quest to survey the whole of the United States' rightful territory. In reality, however, Fremont and his men are on what amounts to a scouting mission for the United States government, who, in 1846, has increasingly explicit interests in seizing the territory comprising northern Mexico known as Alta California. Already known nationwide as the Pathfinder, Fremont views himself as perhaps the preeminent agent of the American concept of manifest destiny, the notion that a continent-spanning nation is the ultimate end and undeniable right of the still relatively new country. John Charles Fremont had been born in Savannah, Georgia in 1813. His father was a French-Canadian schoolteacher, and his mother the youngest daughter of a prominent Virginia plantation owner. After his father's tragic passing in 1818, the family had moved to Charleston, South Carolina, where the precocious young Fremont obtained his early education from a local lawyer by the name of John W. Mitchell. Fremont had briefly attended Charleston College, studying mathematics and natural sciences, before being expelled in 1831 for lack of attendance. While teaching mathematics in the local countryside, however, Fremont had earned the praises of prominent local politician Joel R. Poinsett, a rabid Jacksonian Democrat who was able to leverage his influence to secure Fremont a position teaching mathematics aboard the USS Natchez, a U.S. naval sloop which sailed the seas around South America in 1833. Fremont's tenure on the seas would be short-lived, however, as he soon left this position to accept an appointment as second lieutenant with the U.S. Topographical Corps. Here, he worked surveying a route for the Charleston, Louisville, and Cincinnati Railroad. It was during this time that Fremont's true interest in exploration and map-making was piqued. A stint working in the Carolina mountains only served to solidify his desire to become an explorer, and between 1837 and 1838, he served on a reconnaissance detail in Georgia in preparation for the United States government's removal of the Cherokee tribe from the area. In March of 1837, Fremont's former mentor Joel R. Poinsett was appointed as Secretary of War under President Martin Van Buren. With his new powers of office, Poinsett arranged for Fremont to accompany French scientist and explorer Joseph Nicolet in his exploration of the territory between the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. Serving under Nicolet, Fremont built a reputation as a revered topographer, adept in astronomy, geology, the description of local flora and fauna, as well as being possessive of an inquisitive and ambitious nature. In 1841, he married Jessie Benton, the daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, a Missouri politician and chairman of the Senate Committee on Military Affairs. Thomas Benton had initially refused the 28-year-old Fremont's request for his daughter's hand in marriage, arguing that the young man was not part of American high society and thus not a fitting match for his 16-year-old daughter. However, the couple eventually eloped, and while initially irate at the news, the bride's father eventually warmed to the marriage and to his new son-in-law. A die-hard expansionist and devotee of manifest destiny, Thomas Benton soon advocated for the necessity of sending survey teams west to scout potential transcontinental routes that could facilitate the large numbers of people they believed would soon be flooding into the untouched reaches of the continent. Benton also insisted that his son-in-law, John C. Fremont, was the only acceptable man to place in charge of these exploratory expeditions, with his combination of academic training, real-world experience, and political connections. Beginning in 1842, Fremont had led 3 expeditions. The first began in the summer of 1842, with an exploration of the budding Oregon Trail, following the South Pass that legendary mountain man Jedediah Smith had pioneered through the Rocky Mountains a generation earlier. They returned to Washington in October, and both John and Jessie Fremont soon rose to national renown with their published account of Fremont's expedition, entitled A Report of the Exploring Expedition to the Rocky Mountains, which became a nationwide success virtually overnight, stirring the restless imaginations of countless readers with its accounts of the Rocky Mountains, the Great Plains, and the various peoples, plants, and animals that inhabited the area. The unfettered success of Fremont's first expedition soon saw him appointed to his second, this one charging him with leading another expedition to South Pass, but this time pushing beyond it in a search of a route to the Pacific. This second expedition was equally as successful as the first, if not more so, as Fremont completed the transcontinental journey from Washington to present-day Sacramento, and then back to St. Louis in August of 1844. From here, his account of his second expedition was sent to publication, and in Washington, both the Senate and the House ordered 10,000 copies each. With the success of Fremont's first 2 expeditions, the 1845 election of James K. Polk as president, and continually rising tensions between the United States and Mexico in regards to the territory west of the Mississippi River and north of the Rio Grande, a third expedition was commissioned in 1845. However, this trip, while still being conducted under the auspices of a mere exploration, was planned with far more militaristic ends in mind. Fremont was again placed in charge, and this time specifically commissioned by the War Department to survey the central ranges of the Rocky Mountains, the Great Salt Lake Basin, and the central ranges of the Sierra Nevada Range, with the end goal of ascertaining the strength of the Mexican military in these areas, mapping and recording potential routes of ingress and egress for American military forces, and to determine the loyalty of the local citizenries to the Mexican government. This third expedition had struck out from St. Louis on June 1st of 1845. They traveled west, passing through Bent's Fort and by the Great Salt Lake. When the party reached the Ogden River, today known as the Humboldt River, Fremont divided the men into 2 groups in hopes of doubling his effectiveness in surveillance by covering more ground in more directions. With 16 men, Fremont had arrived at Sutter's Fort, near present-day Sacramento, on December 9th, 1845. Here, he did his utmost to incite an air of patriotic fervor amongst the American expatriates who now called the area home. In the preceding decades, many of the peoples who called Northern California home had built a growing resentment towards the Mexican government, who tended to treat the citizens of Alta California as dismissible inhabitants of an expansive, wild, and altogether unknowable territory that merited little, if any, attention from officials whose constituents and concerns were situated almost entirely around the capital of Mexico City and its surrounding areas. Little in the way of formal official backing, Fremont had promised the aggrieved inhabitants of Sutter's Fort and the surrounding areas that, should they muster a rebellion against their oppressors in the Mexican government, he would ensure they had the full backing and support of the United States government. From Sutter's Fort, Fremont and his small party made their way west to the coastal town of Monterey, where Fremont met with American Consulate Thomas O. Larkin and the official Mexican Comandante, Jose Castro. Here, Fremont managed to simultaneously request replenishments of his supplies, while all the while surreptitiously continuing to survey the area for offensive strengths, defensive vulnerabilities, and local morale. By February of 1846, the party of 45 men who had separated from the original group to survey further north had reunited with Fremont and his group of 16 men at Mission San Jose, just north of Monterey. But the increased size of Fremont's contingent of Americans, as well as the duration of their stay, soon drew the suspicion of Comandante Jose Castro, who eventually ordered that Fremont and his men exit the whole of the Alta California territory. But, rather than acquiesce to the lawful order, Fremont had decided that he and his men would make their stand here, and lay claim to American soil that Fremont believed to be rightfully and providentially theirs. And so now, as word spreads through the nearby ranchos and small towns that a group of Americans had laid claim to Mexican territory in a direct provocation of their local government, Fremont and his men hunker down for the vicious battle to come. Ammunition is plentiful but finite, and with a total force of only 61 men, it is obvious to all that, even with their position atop this high ground, the Americans are not prepared to withstand a prolonged assault. Their nearest infantry reinforcements are hundreds of miles away, and their naval reinforcements practically non-existent here on the Alta California coast. The growing unease amongst the men with their current circumstances leads one amongst them to finally speak up. But this man is no rank-and-file member of the American force. He is, in point of fact, the real driving force behind Fremont's expeditionary successes thus far. His name is Christopher Houston Carson, better known as Kit Carson. Having already spent a decade of his life surviving the continent's harshest environs, few names on the American frontier garner as much reverence and recognition as his. While Fremont has indeed earned his reputation as a tireless explorer, it is Carson who has provided the experience, insight, and essential skills to facilitate that ambition and wanderlust. While politicians in Washington, D.C. could only pontificate on what the vast expanses of the largely unknown frontier might possess, Carson was already long familiar with the territories, landmarks, weather, wildlife, and native tribes that only a handful of Americans had ever even heard of. While barely literate and possessing none of the requisite pedigree of Washington officials, Carson is a master trapper, tracker, tanner of hides, horseman, sharpshooter, navigator, linguist, negotiator, and could build or break down a campsite in mere minutes. He was fleet of foot on the trail, cool under pressure in a fight, and unwavering in his allegiance to his own personal code of honor and ethics. Only a few years prior, at the annual Mountain Man Rendezvous in present-day Wyoming, Carson had challenged a drunken and belligerent Frenchman to a pistol duel on horseback, after he found out the man had publicly affronted one too many trappers and accosted a number of the attending women. The duel had ended with Carson coolly riding towards his opponent before loosing a ball from his pistol that shattered the man's wrist, resulting in his forfeiting the duel. Word of Carson's reputation as not only a skilled trapper, but a man not to be trifled with, had spread far and wide, and by the time he crossed paths with one John C. Fremont, Fremont was well aware of his reputation. The two had met while traveling on a steamboat up the Missouri River, and Fremont had convinced Carson to accompany his expedition and lend them his valuable skills. Time and again in the preceding years, Carson's know-how and wherewithal had been the prevailing cause behind the entire expedition's survival against dire odds. Not at all unaware of Carson's necessity in his successes, Fremont began to include effusive praise for his vaunted guide in the correspondence he sent back to Washington. Once, when report came to their group that a war party of Pawnee warriors were scouring the area, Carson had leapt on his horse, without even pausing to saddle the animal, and, with only rifle in hand and a knife in his belt, ridden off over the rolling prairie hills in order to scout the area for threats. Fremont recounted, quote, "Mounted on a fine horse without a saddle and scouring bareheaded over the prairies, Kit was one of the finest pictures of a horseman I have ever seen." End quote. Soon, these sentiments became part of the national conversation, as Carson's reputation as a sort of frontier superhero spread from the expanses of the prairies to the pages of dime novels and newspapers, eagerly devoured by readers in cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. But Kit Carson, for all his vaunted courage and newfound national acclaim, is no fool. Though he is a flawed man as any, he is not vain, nor concerned with his legacy or his own country's expansion to the extent that he is willing to risk the almost certain deaths of himself and his comrades purely in the name of jingoistic fervor. Carson and the rest of the men atop the mountain believe their task to be increasingly futile with every passing hour, as numbers of Mexican soldiers in the fields below them increase from dozens to hundreds, their leadership and rank and file alike rightfully indignant at the Americans' arrogant and ill-advised occupation of their land. Thomas O. Larkin, the American consulate, himself supports Jose Castro's order for Fremont to vacate the Alta California territory. With years of tensions between Mexico and America already festering, Larkin had become increasingly worried that Fremont's actions would spark the tinderbox of already tenuous relations between the two countries. Now, it seems that bloodshed is inevitable. For their part, the Californio citizens as well take great offense at the incursion of this force of what are effectively foreign spies in their homeland. Though long neglected by the Mexican government as they had been under its predecessor in the Spanish government, the Californios are a fiercely independent people, comprised largely of ranchers, farmers, and vaqueros who carve out livings from the land's abundance while tending to the hostile local tribes, corrupt government officials, and, of course, the hulking California grizzly bears that populate the state in great numbers. They are master horsemen, adept in not only extraordinary feats of riding, but in wielding their long leather riatas in combination with elongated, steel-tipped lances. Though the tactic may appear comically antiquated at first to an enemy force wielding pistols and rifles, the Californio forces have perfected the technique of roping enemy combatants from their horses, at which point their lance-wielding comrades ride in to dispatch the unfortunate man. For their part, the massing Mexican military forces under the command of Comandante Castro are underfunded, under-equipped, and perpetually undermanned. Here on the fringes of Mexico's northernmost territories, they receive little in the way of formal direction or support. However, with the American flag now flying above their mountain peak, their directive is clear: force the Americans to leave at any cost. As rosters are composed and equipment is cleaned and checked amongst the Mexican forces, the consensus amongst Fremont's men, argued foremost by Kit Carson himself, is that there will be no honor to be had in the rout that is to come. They are under no illusions that the sacrifice of their lives will go on to uphold or inspire a revolution against the presiding Mexican government, as it had in Texas with the Battle of the Alamo. Instead, they assume that they will simply be wiped out, left as nothing more than a curious footnote in history as a band of impetuous madmen who had attempted to overthrow a sitting government. However, despite the seemingly utter futility of their situation, Fremont remains unmoved. For 3 long days, despite the consternation from within his ranks, Fremont refuses to surrender his position. Finally, on the 3rd day, it is clear that the Mexican forces in the valley below have been fully assembled. Within the next day, an attack will be imminent. Many among the American men spend their evening picking at their scant rations for supper and deep in concern and anxiety for the terrors that the sunrise will bring. Now, even Fremont's resolve begins to wane. What had seemed such an ignoble and selflessly patriotic act only days earlier, now seems to be a prison of circumstance, trapping Fremont between his competing interests for glory and self-preservation. As the last vestiges of the sun's rays sink below the dark horizon of the Pacific, Many among the Americans believe it to be the last sunset that they will ever see. As darkness sets in, it brings with it the nighttime chill so common to the area. For hour after fitful hour, Fremont, Carson, and the other Americans shiver restlessly under thin blankets as the wind begins to pick up throughout the night. Finally, the sunrise breaks, clear and still, and the men wake to a chilling omen. At some point during the night, the makeshift flagpole that had been erected 4 days earlier has been blown down by the swirling Bay Area winds. Now, the American flag that had flown so boldly lies sullied in the dark soil of Gavilan Peak. The consensus among the men, as the sun continues to rise, is that this final indignity to their nation's colors most assuredly does not bode well for their efforts in the battle to come. Even Fremont, who had watched the sunset without wavering in his resolve to hold the mountaintop, looks upon the soiling of their flag as a particularly bad omen. Suddenly, as the totality of his situation sets in, and the hour of attack nears for the Mexican troops massing down below them, Fremont begins to reconsider his options. He knows that he can either stand and fight, likely at the cost of his own life and the lives of his men, or surrender their position and retreat from the mountain peak. After a few tense minutes of consideration, Fremont finally gives the order for the Americans to strike camp and proceed down the westerly slope of Gavilan Peak. This the men readily do, with most nearly elated at having avoided the fate that had been met in San Antonio a decade earlier by men like Colonel Travis, Jim Bowie, and Davy Crockett. As the sun continues to rise and the area's notorious morning overcast begins to clear, the Mexican forces, too, are relieved to look upon the mountaintop and find it devoid of American forces. Gavilan Peak, where the American forces had made their ill-advised stand, is today known as Fremont Peak, located between the cities of Monterey and Santa Cruz, California. Fremont will go on to move his men north, heading through the northern reaches of the San Joaquin Valley before pushing on to Klamath Lake in Oregon. On the way, the expedition encountered several native tribes, and hostilities ensued, with several natives left dead and more bad will being accumulated by Fremont in the California territory. However, Fremont, Carson, and the men of this expedition will find no respite in Oregon. Soon, they will be called back to California after being located in the middle of the wilderness by a United States Marine captain on a top-secret mission with correspondence from Washington, D.C. But before Fremont and his men can make their way south again, they will find themselves victims to a surprise attack by the Klamath tribe, who are incensed at the Americans' presence in their lands. This will cost the lives of several expedition members and result in a retributory raid with sickening consequences for the local native tribes. Though the fight for the mountaintop has been narrowly avoided, the coming Mexican-American War will only intensify in California in the coming years. But the countless tales of John C. Fremont, Kit Carson, and the other Americans who will make their way westward in the fight for American expansion in the coming years, as well as the stories of the Mexican citizens and the native tribes who sought to retain their own homelands, are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
In 1827, a bedraggled group of mountain men made their way in a long train of humans and pack animals through the Mojave Desert in what is today southeastern California. As temperatures soared and water supplies dwindled, the leader of the party, Jedediah Strong Smith, hoped to make contact with the tribe who had saved him when he passed through this same territory a year ago. The tribe, who gave the desert its name, were known as the Mojave. A year before, reaching the Mojave had been Smith's saving grace. Like all mountain men expeditions, he and his company had been in search of territory that was both abundant in beaver and unclaimed by any notable military power, be that native tribes or European or Mexican officials. The world of the mountain men was steeped in cultural, national, and ethnic ambiguity. Their goal was not to destroy or subvert any of the peoples they came across, but to accumulate as many furs as possible, namely beaver pelts, and to head back east to make use of their fortunes by buying land or otherwise improving their station in American society. Jedediah Smith had come west from New York as a young man, finding his way onto an expedition out of St. Louis. He learned quickly that in order to survive in the austere and often inhospitable American West, one had to adapt quickly, think clearly, and move decisively. Or they would soon die a hard death, many miles from home. This was a world of gray, where the enemy of one's enemy was a friend until they too became an enemy. Such was the case for Jedediah Smith's beleaguered party. In the intervening year, trappers from another band based out of Taos, New Mexico, had abused and killed a number of Mojave before swiftly departing from their lands, headed west to California. The Mojave saw no difference, nor would they have any real way of telling, in the Taos party that had abused them and Smith's party, which finally found their village and dragged themselves in, begging for food, water, and fresh horses. At first, the Mojave were friendly enough, sharing and trading food and water, though refusing to part with any horses. Actually, considering the circumstances, they were pretty darn nice. Smith even ran into a Mojave man named Francisco who had worked for his expedition the year before. Francisco was friendly, but informed Smith of the Taos trappers killing his tribesmen during the last year and hanging their bodies from trees. Smith knew this was certainly not good, and beseeched Francisco to take gifts to his chief and inform him that Smith and his party had no intention of committing any such acts, and only hoped to resupply and move on westward. The Mojave, for their part, seemed willing enough to help. They helped the trappers resupply and gave them fresh mounts, even provided grass canoes so the trappers could more easily cross the Colorado River with their belongings. The mountain men were exceedingly grateful for the help and seemingly unaware of any danger. But when they were halfway across the river, the Mojave sprang their attack, attacking with a barrage of arrows, rocks, and spears. In what took only a matter of seconds, 10 men were hacked, pierced, and bludgeoned to death as their dying screams mixed with the war cries of the Mojave, the cracking of bones, and the placid rippling of the Colorado River. The attack took place with such ferocity and surprise, the 9 remaining members could only make their way as fast as possible to the other side, amidst a barrage of arrows and rocks and spears, to try and take cover. And as the Mojave hacked the 10 unfortunate trappers into pieces, and also carried off 2 native women traveling with the party, there was a momentary lull in their attack. As Smith took stock of their available weaponry, some knives, some hatchets, and 5 rifles with limited ammunition. And what must have been an agonizing few minutes of nerve-rattling silence, the men lashed knives to the longest, straightest branches they could find, double-checked the shot in their rifles, and unsheathed their hatchets in anticipation of the close, bloody conflict to come. Smith wrote in his diary that he had reassured his men that they would in fact survive the attack that was soon to come. But, he confided, he did not actually believe this was possible. However, he remained cool, and after allowing the oncoming Mojave to charge within rifle range, ordered a volley to be shot into their midst. 2 Mojaves were killed outright. It was never the custom of any native tribe to sacrifice large numbers of warriors to gain a victory or a position, and accordingly, the Mojave broke their attack and retreated to the safety of the village. This afforded the trappers a chance to slip out into the desert and head west from near today's Needles, California, to today's San Fernando Valley. Here, they were found and cared for by a local California rancher. Then, they set about their way north through the San Joaquin Valley in hopes of meeting with a group that they had left there the year before. From here, near the present-day city of Modesto, they were to continue northward on a journey that would see them survive inclement weather, hostile European powers, and, on another, perhaps even more terrifying occasion, an attack at the hands of the Umpqua tribe. Smith would go on to survive that trip, make it all the way back to the yearly rendezvous in Wyoming, and even tried to retire in St. Louis. But soon, the trail would call him again, and at the age of 33, Jedediah Smith would be murdered on the Cimarron River by a band of the notoriously ruthless Comanche. His story is perhaps the greatest unknown odyssey in American history. But that is a story that will have to wait for another time.
San Diego, California, December 8, 1846. In the middle of the night, in the desert 30 miles east of the city, Kit Carson, legendary American mountain man, lies face down in the dirt, not moving a muscle, and doing his best to slow his breathing. Mere yards away, a Mexican soldier on sentry duty sits atop his fine Californio horse, coolly smoking a cigaretto and enjoying a brief moment of relaxation and solitude in the middle of the Southern California desert. Carson knows that should this soldier discover his location, he and his two comrades will assuredly be taken prisoner and likely executed. Still, as Carson grits his teeth, the soldier remains blissfully unaware of any enemy presence, merely enjoying his cigarette, filling the air around himself with the fragrant smell of burning tobacco, and peacefully observing the night sky above him. The unnerving scene drags on for several minutes, with the silence of the desert night making the already tense air of the situation all but unbearable. Suddenly, Carson grows even more concerned. With one ear pressed tightly to the ground, he hears a faint, thundering rhythm. He wonders if these are the hoofbeats of more Californio soldiers coming to join their comrade. Then, Carson feels a hand nudging one of his boots. As Carson strains his eyes down and behind himself, he sees the cause of the noise. It is, in fact, the racing heartbeat of one of his companions, the 24-year-old naval lieutenant Edward Beale. Lieutenant Beale, his nerves pushed to the literal breaking point, whispers to Carson, "We're gone. Let's jump up and fight it out." "Been in worse places before," Carson assures him, then turns back to flatten himself against the desert floor. Finally, the Californio finishes his indulgent smoke and returns to his main camp, much to the relief of Carson and his comrades. Carson is part of a three-man group of volunteers, comprised of himself, Lieutenant Beale, and a Diegueño native guide named Chamacta. They are on a mission to reach the American-held port of San Diego in order to send reinforcements back to their stranded comrades roughly 30 miles east of San Diego. The day before, the Americans, a combined force of U.S. Army soldiers, Navy sailors, Marines, and civilian volunteers, had fought a vicious battle against the local Californio forces. The battle, known to history as the Battle of San Pascual, had been fought in the interest of the ongoing Mexican-American War, in which Mexico seeks to retain control of its lands, which comprise most of the present-day American Southwest and Pacific Northwest. When the damp weather had rendered many of their firearms inoperable, the Americans had suffered dearly at the end of the Californio's rudimentary, but deathly effective, steel-tipped lances. After the Americans were able to bring forth and fire their brass field cannons, the Californio forces had been finally forced to disperse, but not before killing 18 Americans and inflicting countless more deep, grievous wounds in the bodies of the surviving men. Under the command of General Stephen F. Kearny, himself gravely injured after suffering a lance wound to his lower back, the Americans had retreated to the top of a small rock-strewn hill. Here, they found themselves surrounded by roaming Californio forces, who covered virtually all of the territory between themselves and their nearest comrades in the port of San Diego, thus cutting off any hope of escape or relief. The U.S. Army soldiers amongst this group of men under General Kearny had not only survived the battle, they have completed the longest cross-country trek in U.S. military history up to that point, traversing half the length of the continent after marching out of Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and traveling through Santa Fe. They had then trekked across the barren deserts of the Southwest before finally meeting the Mexican Army in battle here in the desert east of San Diego. Their counterparts in the U.S. Marines and Navy sailors, riding under the command of U.S. Marine Captain Archibald Gillespie, had ridden out to reinforce Kearny's men. Now, these men, many of whom are unable to walk, much less make the 30-mile trek through enemy territory, had to rely on their able-bodied comrades to volunteer to make this perilous journey in order to send back reinforcements and ultimately save their lives. Among these able-bodied men, none was a more obvious choice for this seemingly impossible task than Kit Carson. Among the few participants in the battle on the American side not to hold an official position in the military, Carson has nonetheless already cemented his legacy as an inveterate mountain man, guide, and experienced gunfighter. After deterring a cross-country mission with secret correspondence for President James K. Polk in order to assist Kearny as a civilian guide, Carson had proven an invaluable asset to both the general and his men. Along with Carson, the two other exceedingly brave men, Lieutenant Beale and Chimocta, had volunteered to venture forth into the expanses of the hilly, chaparral-covered desert in order to at least attempt to save their comrades. They had waited until nightfall before making their initial scramble down the sandy cliffs of the rocky hill, being cautious to avoid the Californio sentries that lined the hillsides all around them. By the time the party had reached the bottom of the hill, it had become clear that their metal canteens would be too noisy to carry with them. They had thus each taken one last, long drink and left their only water supplies tucked into the rocks of a small arroyo. Carson and Lieutenant Beale had also discovered that, unfortunately, their hard-soled boots would cause too much commotion while they traversed the rocky ground before them. While their native comrade Chimocta continued on relatively unencumbered and silent in his leather moccasins, the pair of Americans had been forced to remove their boots, tuck them into their belts, and proceed forward barefoot. Now, as the Mexican soldier rides back towards his camp, Carson and Beale are suddenly horrified to realize that, somewhere in their crawling on the desert floor, their boots have come loose from their belts. Considering their already precarious position, retracing their steps to look for the boots is out of the question, and thus both men will have to complete the 30-mile trek through the thorny desert barefoot. With no other option, the three men carry on, silently trudging their way through the sparse landscape, sticking as best they can to the cover of dry riverbeds and small ravines. Despite their lack of footwear, they travel as quickly as possible, knowing that the rising sun will bring with it a host of new problems. Meanwhile, back at the American camp atop the isolated hill, the men find themselves in increasingly dire straits. Food supplies have already begun to wane, as has their supply of potable water. Many of the injured men are starting to see signs of infection, as the deep and incongruous nature of the damage inflicted by the long steel lance tips makes them exceedingly difficult to close and keep clean. Since the day of the battle, Sergeant John S. Griffin has worked feverishly to tend to the Americans' wounds, but it seems to the doctor that a never-ending stream of the bloodied, injured men pour through the canvas-flap doors of his operating tent. General Kearny himself, suffering from the lance wounds that had torn into his lower back and hip, had passed out on the dirt floor of the tent after insisting that more seriously wounded men be tended to ahead of himself. Simply in order to move the injured men from the site of the battlefield to the hilltop, Kearny's men had constructed makeshift travois. These two long poles, which connect at a point, after which a bed is built between the poles and attached to a horse, had for centuries provided the tribes of the Great Plains with an effective, efficient means of transporting goods and people. However, on the rock-strewn, hilly grounds of the Southern California desert, they provided a nightmarishly jarring, bone-rattling ride for their unfortunate, incapacitated passengers. Now, the few able-bodied men left have taken to killing and cooking their mules, beginning with the weakest and least useful animals, stewing the meat into a thin, greasy soup that the men do their best to keep down, with some being unable to do so. General Stephen Kearny, suffering greatly from loss of blood, has relinquished command to Captain Henry Smith Turner. The general, who had once led his forces out of Kansas to much nationalistic fervor, pomp, and circumstance, now lies prostrate, pale, and helpless inside of his tent. When they had first arrived atop the hill, Turner had ordered some of his able-bodied men to engage and drive off the Californio Lancer forces that stalked their movements and harassed them incessantly. This his men had managed to do, with their carbines proving far more effective now that the conditions had warmed and their powder had dried. But now, as the Americans languish on the hilltop, Mexican Commander Don Andres Pico's men and other contingents of Mexican soldiers and Californio volunteers begin to flood into the surrounding areas, looking to cut off any escape for their enemy and to mount a final charge to decimate their forces once and for all. Now effectively trapped and with their ammunition and food supplies dwindling further and further, Captain Turner is faced with the prospect of either turning out their remaining starving mules and horses to graze, in which case they would almost certainly be stolen by the surrounding Mexican forces, or to slaughter the animals immediately, rendering he and his men truly devoid of any means of transportation, save for walking to San Diego. The American soldiers know that, with every Mexican soldier who arrives to surround their position, the likelihood of Carson, Beale, and Chimocta reaching San Diego has become less and less. Don Andres Pico himself has, in fact, surmised that it will likely be Kit Carson, if anyone among the Americans, who will make a bid to escape to San Diego and secure reinforcements. Though the two men do not know each other personally, Pico is familiar with Carson's prior exploits throughout the whole of Alta California. He knows that Kit Carson is a dangerous man, and that in order to secure a victory for the Mexican forces, he will have to be neutralized. Carson is known amongst the Mexican forces as El Lobo, or the Wolf, and Don Andres Pico has explicitly warned his forces to remain vigilant, or se escapada el Lobo. The Wolf will escape. Now, as the hours pass on the hilltop, it seems more and more probable to the stranded men that their comrades' bid to reach American lines in San Diego has failed, resulting in either their capture, killing, or both. But, miles away, past the edge of the western horizon, Kit Carson, Lieutenant Beale, and Chimocta press on through the night, accumulating untold damage to their feet as they plod their way through the unforgiving landscape. By dawn the next morning, they are clear of the initial rings of Mexican security forces that surround their stranded comrades. By that afternoon, they are within 12 miles of the city of San Diego. But now, they face the challenge of navigating undetected through the several rings of security forces that surround the city and its harbor. Seeing that seemingly every known path to the city's limits are blocked by the Mexican sentries, the three men huddle in a shaded arroyo and confer upon their next move. Carson advises that they split up, a chilling proposition to all those involved, but a prudent one, as Carson wagers that capturing 3 individuals will be a tougher job for the Mexican army than simply capturing one group. And so, all 3 determine their separate paths, with Chimocta and Lieutenant Beale taking the 2 shorter routes, and Carson volunteering for the longer, more dangerous route. With no time for ceremony or sentimentalities, the 3 men part ways, heading west to the California coast, with each knowing that they will either succeed in their endeavor or, likely, die, and that the lives of their comrades stranded on the hilltop depend on them. All through the afternoon, into the night, the 3 men skulk through enemy territory, each on an individual journey of turmoil, peril, and endurance that will test them to their absolute limits. It will be past midnight when Chimocta and Beale reach the American lines, arriving around the same time, with each man so fatigued that they have to be taken to the USS Congress, stationed in the San Diego harbor, where they will linger near death for several days. Carson staggers into camp around 3 a.m., his more circuitous route having delayed him even longer than his comrades. In a near-delirious state of exhaustion, Carson confirms the location of Kearny and Gillespie's forces on the hilltop with Commodore John F. Stockton. Stockton informs him that reinforcements have been dispatched, and Carson finally partakes in the first food, water, and sleep he has seen in nearly 36 hours. Meanwhile, the men stranded on the hilltop, still with no clue as to the whereabouts of their relief party, continue with their struggle to care for their wounded comrades, with their infected wounds presenting increasingly more frightening spectacles with seemingly every examination, as well as to sustain themselves amid their shortage of food and water. The last of the starving mules are finally killed, their ailing and withered bodies offered up as a last-ditch form of sustenance to their starving masters. Though it is an unfortunate necessity, one that provides much-needed nourishment to the men, the gruesome, heart-wrenching spectacle of this slaughter only serves to further weaken morale, as well as to cement the notion that they are truly without escape in the middle of the barren Southern California desert. In order to quench their thirst, the men dig into the sand, until reaching a layer that has retained some level of moisture from the recent rainfall. The soil is heaped into squares of cloth, then any available liquid, however muddy and disagreeable, is wrung out. For 2 long days and nights, this harrowing ordeal continues. Finally, though, General Kearny is able to regain enough strength to return to command. His field sergeant, Dr. Griffin, informs him that, likewise, most of the injured men have regained enough strength to sit horseback. With their supplies nearly gone, and any hope of rescue seeming to be fleeting, Kearny orders the men to ready themselves for a forced march to San Diego at first light. Come what may, they will not sit on this hilltop to fall prey to their adversaries. At dawn, they will make a run for their lives to the coast. However, that night, as the tired and battle-sore men sleep fitfully, an American sentry on guard is sent into a near panic by the sound of an approaching force of cavalry. He calls out into the darkness, "Halt! Who goes there?" The call goes unanswered, with the thundering hoofbeats only getting closer and closer to the sentry's position. With his weapon now shouldered, the sentry calls out again, "Who goes there?" This time, however, the reply nearly brings the weary man to tears of joy as Captain William H. Emery, commander of the 200-man relief forces dispatched from San Diego, calls out, "Hold fire! We're Americans." The American camp now resounds with the cheers of men who, only hours before, had seen their hopes of survival as all but lost. In the midst of their celebrations, a single shot rings out from a Mexican sniper hidden in the hills, striking harmlessly into the ground. It would be the last shot of the entire engagement, as the Americans would find all of the Mexican forces gone in the morning, having returned under nightfall to Los Angeles to fortify that city against the newly realized American threat. The combined American forces will make their march to San Diego without so much as seeing another opposing soldier. They arrive on December 12th on a chilly, rainy day, much to the relief of Carson, Stockton, and the rest of their countrymen. Many among the American soldiers are overcome with emotion upon seeing the Pacific Ocean for the first time, as the endless stretch of water before them represents the culmination of their unprecedentedly long and arduous transcontinental journey. Though the war is not over, it feels for many of the young sailors, soldiers, and Marines that the worst of the war, for them, has come and gone. The spot where they had made their desperate stand and survived on the flesh of their mules will stand as a landmark of San Diego history, known forevermore as Mule Hill. What has only begun, though, is the national renown and celebrity of Christopher Houston Carson. His leadership during, before, and after the battle and his willingness to lay down his life in order to aid in the rescue effort make him a favorite topic of letters written home from American soldiers, sailors, and Marines now stationed in San Diego. One soldier pens a particularly effusive letter home to his parents in Connecticut, proclaiming that, "Never has there been a man like Kit Carson. All that has been said about him, and more, is true. He is as fearless as the lion, as stealthy as the panther, as strong as the oxen. I believe that Carson would attack a fort filled with Mexicans, single-handed, and drive them off." Carson, for his part, barely even acknowledges his accomplishments in his memoirs, writing laconically that, "Finally got through, but had the misfortune of having lost our shoes. Had to travel over a country covered with prickly pear and rocks, barefoot. Got to San Diego the next night." In the years to come, Carson will become a national media star, the subject of dime novels and newspaper articles that will cause his name to be as well known in many eastern cities as the president. The young naval lieutenant Edward Beale is said to have convalesced for an entire year before returning to active duty with the Navy, but he too will go on to national acclaim and a legendary career spanning decades of service in the Old West. Already known as a hero of the Battle of San Pasqual, he would rise to even greater fame in 1848 as the man to bring the first samples of gold from the streams of Northern California to the cities of the East. This tangible proof of the newly won state's gilded bounty would be a key driving factor in the 1849 California Gold Rush, an event that would reshape the nation forever. He would go on to a career as a successful diplomat, serving as superintendent of the Office of Indian Affairs before retiring to life as a rancher. He would remain friends with Carson, who remarked upon seeing his friend aboard the USS Congress that he, quote, "did not think that he could live," as well as maintained friendships with Buffalo Bill Cody, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Ulysses S. Grant, among others. He would pass away in 1893 at his home in Chester, Pennsylvania. Chamacta, the Diegueño native guide, by some accounts took a similarly long time to recover, and, by some accounts, perished as a result of his treacherous journey. His tribe, known amongst themselves as the Kumeyae, already brought to the breaking point under the yoke of decades of Californio rule, would continue to struggle under the United States government for much of the 19th century. They would play pivotal roles in the San Diego Tax Rebellion of 1851, also known as Guerra's Revolt, as well as the Yuma War and even the Mexican Revolution. Today, Chamacta's band, the San Pasqual Band of Diego Mission Indians of California, is a federally recognized tribe, with many of their tribal members residing on the San Pasqual Reservation. As for Kit Carson, he will take over a week of recovering in San Diego before regaining the ability to walk normally, his feet so battered by the desert floor that he can scarcely take but a few steps without excruciating pain for days. But recover he will. Carson will soon be on the trail again, heading west to reunite with his family in Taos, New Mexico. Already an American icon and an inveterate frontiersman, Carson will go on to continue his exploits for decades to come. His travels will take him from San Diego, back through the treacherous deserts of Arizona and New Mexico, then to St. Louis, before finally settling in Taos for a few years before continuing his adventures. Though the Mexican-American War in California will continue with a series of minor skirmishes, the worst of the action in California has largely passed. The Battle of San Pasqual will go down as the bloodiest, most consequential battle of the Mexican-American War to be fought on California's soil. The Mexican-American War itself will drag on until 1848, finally coming to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But, though the men of Kearny's army can now take their rest, the battles that are taking place further south into Mexico, and the battles that will continue to unfold for the coming year, will go down as some of the most vicious, bloodthirsty combat ever waged in the 19th century. But the stories of the many brutal battles of the unforgiving and highly controversial Mexican-American War, as well as the many tales from the life of Kit Carson, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. If you liked this story, click on one of the videos on your screen now to hear more. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Old West history, Be sure to sign up for the daily History at the OK Corral newsletter. Link is in the description. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.